Hi, I'm Lucy Alexander with AIChE, and I'm here with Professor Peter Eisenberger, who is the Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Columbia University, and also the co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Global Thermostat. So I wanted to talk to you about what kind of focus shift you would like to see in CCUS R&D.
Thank you very much. Well, what I've been struck by in working in technology on air capture is if one looks at the issue of the climate change risk, that really the only way to do that is to have a technology that's is so-called negative carbon, and that is that that is where you have a net decrease in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So right now in the U.S. and almost globally, the focus has been on a quantity called avoided carbon. And avoided carbon is something where you have some process. Let's say you have a coal plant and you're producing electricity, and if you clean up the coal plant by putting some CCS on it and store some of that underground, you can get some carbon credits for doing that. However, one has to remember that in a full life cycle analysis, that carbon originally came from the ground, right? And then since at best you capture 90% of the carbon in these technologies in CCS, and since you have transportation fuels that you're never going to collect the carbon from, when you look at it, the best you're going to be able to do is reduce the amount of carbon going in the atmosphere by maybe a factor of 2 if you cleaned up all power plants in the world at the 90% efficiency. There's leakages and all these problems. So I'm struck by the fact that we are spending all our money, all our research dollars, $20 billion in the U.S. has gone into carbon capture and sequestration from coal plants, and it doesn't solve the problem. You can take the IPCC scenarios and put in this factor of 2 decrease in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's still going to be a climate crisis. And the analogy I use to communicate to the average person is, imagine the climate crisis can be modeled as a bathtub where you have water going into the bathtub, and if the water goes over the edge of the bathtub, you have a crisis. And what everybody's talking about in avoided carbon is reducing the rate at which the water is flowing into the bathtub. But it's still going in, and eventually it's going to overfill. And detailed mathematical models show that. And because of that reason, for the first time, the IPCC just came out with the notion that we may have to go to negative carbon. Now, when they talk about going to negative carbon, which is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, right, they use the term geoengineering. And that frightens a lot of people, because most of geoengineering, like fertilizing the ocean or things of that nature, are in fact, the cure could be worse than the problem. But when it comes to direct air capture from the air, all you're doing is pollution prevention, because we put the CO2 in the air, it's a pollutant, it's warming up the atmosphere, and we're just taking that same CO2 out. And so my belief is that it's very important that we understand that the path we're on, focusing our R&D on avoided carbon, is not going to get us to a solution, and we should have spending R&D dollars to understand how to make air capture economically feasible. Now, in our company, we believe we've already demonstrated that, but because we're a private company, we cannot share that with others. However, if the public were to spend money on its own R&D, they would be able to make an assessment of the cost and be able to convince themselves that it was economically viable, and then have policies that reflected correctly that we should have a whole carbon framework that is around negative carbon and not around avoided carbon. And unfortunately, because the concentrations are so different between flue gas at 3% or 5% or 10% CO2 and air capture, which is 400 parts per million, most of the technologies that are applicable for developing to take CO2 out of the air are not applicable for flue gas. And so you really want to get on a learning curve. You want to start investments that will take you eventually to a solution. The analogy I make with solar. When first solar came on, it was 1,000 times more expensive than it was economically viable. But over years, because it was viewed as important, we have lots of smart people, we have lots of innovation, and we drive the cost down. So my concern is, we're spending all these R&D dollars, all these brilliant young people and creative people trying to make carbon capture and sequestration from power plants, from flue gas, lower cost, and it's not solving the problem. It's a dead end, right? And so I really think that this has to be better understood, right? And the analogy I would use is, and it's a little unfair, and I don't mean to be that negative about it. But it's like a cigarette company telling you, well, I put a filter on the cigarette, right? And that extended the life in which we kept on smoking and kept on killing ourselves, but it didn't solve the problem of preventing one from getting cancer and all the health effects. So it's understandable that the existing fossil fuels, which our whole civilization depended upon. I'm not one of these people that think people who do fossil fuels are evil people or doing a bad thing. They provided us all the good things that we all now benefit. But now we know that we have gotten so successful that our success has created a problem, and it's time to change. We've changed before. We used to burn wood, right? And we don't do that anymore for our power source. So the fact that we have to change our energy sources, clean up the pollutants, the CO2. Now it turns out, which is so wonderful actually, because on the one hand, when you think about carbon from a fossil fuel plant, you think about it as a pollutant. However, when you think about CO2 from the air, it's a source of life, right? Photosynthesis uses CO2. Nature makes its energy. Nature makes its building materials out of carbon. And so if you take your CO2 from the air and you take your hydrogen from water, then humans can mimic the natural process, and it's sustainable forever because it's a closed loop. Just like the natural system, if you take your CO2 from the air, you take your hydrogen from water, when you combust your fuel, you put the CO2 back in the air and you put water. That's the only product that comes from combustion. So you have a completely closed cycle if you start with CO2 from the air. Now, to get lower carbon concentrations, there are many processes which are really interesting, which is the new buzzword that I think it should be the focus of research, is CCUS. That is, you capture the carbon from the air, not from the flue gas, you use it in some process that enables you to get the benefit from that carbon, but also at the same time sequesters some of it. And a classic example of this that exists already, and we're working on a project that in our company, is to take CO2 from the air, hydrogen from water, feed wastewater to algae. The algae convert, with the sunlight, convert that into biomass. That biomass is then able to be converted to fuel. And it turns out that 20% in the conversion process is left as a residue in the form of biochar. And so you can take that biochar and use it as a fertilizer. But that biochar has the carbon all locked into it. So someday our company is looking forward to advertising, drive your car to clean the planet. Because every time you go around the cycle, you will simultaneously be providing the energy you need for your transportation sector, but also providing 20% to fertilize the planet.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Eisenberger, and hopefully we'll see a shift in focus to more carbon negative technologies in the near future.
Thank you.